A once well-respected writer for the Harry Potter books, J.K. Rowling used to be an inspiration to some. A single working-class mother creating a fantasy world that generations of people could lose themselves into. The Harry Potter series has been regarded as sacred to some fans, shaping their viewpoints and their morals around discrimination, the importance of kindness, courage, and acceptance. Over the years, Rowling's actions towards her series have been slightly problematic, from insinuating sexualities of her characters to flat out rewriting their ethnicity. J.K. Rowling's attempt to show her inclusive nature has come under some vast criticism. This all started in 2007 when Rowling surprised the world by announcing that Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, was actually gay. The act of making such an important staple character in the books canonically homosexual was well received by many fans, as it insinuated that despite the lack of appeal to sexuality in the books, the Harry Potter world was inclusive after all. Since the films were on their way to be produced and the books were already released at this point, many fans wondered if JK would ever explicitly address Dumbledore's sexuality when it came to within the films and within the books. Now, you could argue that the new twist that JK Rowling has put into the narrative is her attempt to be inclusive, especially when it comes to sexuality and race. Although the original Harry Potter books and films did include some non-white characters such as Kingsley Shacklebolt and Cho Chang, these were supporting cast members, so the main protagonists and the main characters were all white and straight. Even Dumbledore's sexuality wasn't addressed in the film, creating quite a heteronormative narrative. Although you could argue that the decisions to make key characters more ethnically diverse in the Fantastic Beasts films, such as Leta Lestrange, was a step in the right direction, you could argue that their characterization is still quite controversial, with their problematic backstories, horrible fates, and lack of development in their storyline and their personalities in comparison to the other white key characters. Of course, inclusivity is a brilliant thing, and it's so good to see modern writers and filmmakers trying to incorporate and achieve this in their creations. However, rewriting something in canon, such as race and ethnicity, when the original source material does not acknowledge it or actually contradicts it, implies that Rowling's seemingly inclusive act was just an attempt to pander to more communities, either to avoid criticism or to make more sales. And if you are only being inclusive to silence criticism, or to achieve higher ratings, or to sell more books, then your actions are actually quite disingenuous and you don't deserve the praise for them. There have been arguments that sexuality is not actually key or important to the book or the story, so a lot of people argue back, saying that it's not that important, that it's not addressed. However, after the Goblet of Fire, you do see relationships and teenage drama and romance and dating written into the narrative, so there is actually no proper reason for there not to be any openly gay characters, at least in terms of logistics. Adding something like this would not take away from the main storyline. If Dumbledore addressed that he was gay or his sexuality was mentioned in the books, it would not change his character, nor would it change his part in Harry's journey. However, if you were to argue that his sexuality was not relevant to the story and it shouldn't be mentioned in the source material, then why mention it at all, right? Unless you're pandering to another audience, that is. Now, at this point, J.K. Rowling had become a bit of a meme, with all of her weird additions just becoming laughable and typical J.K. Rowling. However, over the last few months, Rowling has found herself as part of a more controversial narrative. In early June, J.K. came under a lot of scrutiny for some tweets that she posted regarding the transgender community. That's one way to be inclusive. On June 6, 2020, Rowling tweeted about something that mentioned people who menstruate and seemed to take quite a lot of offence to the fact that the word woman wasn't mentioned. People who menstruate. I'm sure there used to be a word for those. Someone help me out. Women? Whippend? Womed? You're not funny. I've seen stuff on this recently on Twitter around Superdrug changing their titles of sanitary products to say people who menstruate rather than for women, and there has been an uproar that I don't quite understand. Now, speaking from my own experience, I don't understand why people who are cis would personally care about the phrase people who menstruate. At the end of the day, when it's that time of the month, I don't look for products that say for women on them, as I'm pretty sure if it's a tampon, it's gonna, work as a tampon. It's not for me because it doesn't say women on it. I'm just a person now, I'm not a woman. Get a fucking grip. Changing who this is for on the packaging in this case does not change the intended use or the quality of the product. Therefore, no matter whether it is addressed as something that should be used by women or by people, the phrasing on the packet as a cis woman is not going to impact me. But if it's not noticeable, then why is it being changed in the first place? Well, it won't impact me because I'm cis, but it could impact people who are trans, who are non-cis. They are the ones that are going to notice this. And arguably putting for women on the packet suggests that only women menstruate, or menstruation is a womanly thing. But let me tell you something that's going to blow your mind, JK. Not all women menstruate. And not all people who menstruate are women. What? This is because you can identify as a man or a woman regardless of whether you have a uterus or not, and regardless of whether it actually works and menstruates. And what do you know, there is a difference between sex and gender identity. If your biological sex was female, that means you would have the reproductive system of a female, which means that your body would menstruate, hypothetically. But there are cases where this does not happen as well. Gender does interact with sex, but it is not the same thing. Sex refers to the different biological characteristics of females, males, and intersex, such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. Your gender identity, however, is how you personally deeply feel in relation to gender norms and gender roles, and your individual experience of gender. This may or may not correspond with the sex that you align with at birth. So in the cases of sanitary products, you could have more than one gender using the products, and therefore the word people is more inclusive than just saying women. And by saying women exclusively, you could encourage gender dysphoria for those who may not identify as a woman, but have the biological sex as a female and therefore menstruate. Now, to put it simply, gender dysphoria is the distress a person can feel due to the mismatch of their gender and the sex that they are assigned at birth. This can be made worse by those who signpost that certain bodily functions are a result of you being one gender and not the other, when in actual fact it's to do with your sex and your biological makeup and nothing to do with your gender identity. Now, menstruation has become this womanly thing that only women can experience, as if bleeding from your uterus is the most feminine thing out there. And the narrative that menstruation is exclusive to women is quite toxic and quite damaging to people of the trans community, and also to those who are female but do not menstruate. If you have a biological female who cannot menstruate due to reproductive issues and they identify as a woman, this doesn't change their gender all because they cannot menstruate. And from this logic, having a period does not confirm your gender or make you any less or more of the gender you identify as. Although this tweet did get a lot of backlash, this did not stop J.K. Rowling writing more about her views on the issue in further detail. If sex isn't real, there is no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. However, acknowledging that someone is the gender that they identify as is not erasing sex. If anything, putting people who menstruate on the packaging is erasing gender. You do realise that gender and sex are two different things, don't you? Sure, I've probably made that clear by now. You think that someone who goes on to say that she's done a lot of research in her blog would know this? It has been believed that sex and gender are one and the same, and it's not. Maybe if she actually did the research she claims to have done, this woman would know that. This still wasn't enough for J.K. Rowling, as on the 10th of June, she published a lengthy post on her website and sent out a tweet about turf wars. In this post, she basically explains that she's become interested in trans issues whilst researching a character that she's writing. It just gets worse, doesn't it? On September 14th, this book, Troubled Blood, sparked another round of outrage after a release of an early review. Now, the book reportedly follows a detective who's trying to hunt down a cis man who dresses up as a woman in order to kill cis women. Inclusivity at its finest, and the Telegraph review basically describes it as a book whose morals seem to be never trust a man in a dress. Now, this is obviously extremely transphobic, implying that males that dress in women's clothing are doing so with malicious intent. And so this further stigmatises those who were born with the biological sex as male but choose to identify as a woman, when the only somewhat representation of the T part of the LGBTQI+ community is that of a man dressing up as a woman. You could argue that in hindsight, J.K. Rowling rewriting canon to be inclusive was not an attempt to be inclusive at all, but rather to receive praise and to receive attention. And now, having latched onto a very controversial and dangerous narrative, she will undoubtedly get a lot of attention and probably some praise from those bigots in society who refuse to open their minds and move the fuck on from gender roles and gender equaling sex. But in a time where politicians are still trying to make it increasingly difficult for people to identify as what they are, the last thing the trans community needs is a middle-aged, white cis woman scaremongering and fueling the stigma around trans women. A trans woman will dress as a woman because they identify as a woman. But creating a book where someone cross-dresses with ill intent after creating drama on Twitter with transphobic tweets seems like a very interesting advertisement stunt. And so her book, as it already has done, will likely get a lot of media attention, possibly pushing sales further and fueling a very dark narrative around sex and gender. But can something be done about this, I hear you ask? Yes. You can have an impact. Some members of the trans community have come forward asking people to cut ties with J.K. Rowling's creations, implying that you cannot be for trans rights if you are still purchasing new instalments of the Harry Potter series, such as the new game that is being released. For those whose acknowledgement of existence is not threatened by Rowling's viewpoints, this could seem quite extreme. And over the last decade or so, there have been many discussions around the separation of art from the artist, and it seems like there is a fair amount of support for this narrative. Now, a lot of Harry Potter fans, such as myself, are finding it very difficult to let this series go, but also feel conflicted with supporting a series that was written by a raging TERF. And for many people, they hold this series quite closely, viewing it as indispensable, a part of their childhood and a part of their very lives. However, as stated in an article, the art that we regard as genius or uphold as indispensable from human history is also part of this world, therefore tethered to and a product of existing systems of power. This is a bit complex, but it's basically the fact that our perception of art is shaped by who we celebrate and who we silence through it. Because art does not actually exist in its own universe, the appreciation of it directly benefits the artists. In this case, J.K. Rowling. By continuing to celebrate her work, it seems like we are silencing the outcries against her transphobia, implying that her place as an author will not be revoked because of her actions, and she will therefore receive little to no consequences, which is quite dangerous as it shows that people can come forward with quite discriminatory views and not be punished, implying that discrimination and transphobia is not regarded as as serious a thing as it is. But the Harry Potter fan in you didn't say anything wrong, did you? You're not transphobic. So why should a series that you hold dear be tainted? Why should you miss out because of what an author has done? And what the author has done doesn't change the series, does it? It doesn't change the story and it doesn't change the characters. All of these thought processes that may go through your mind in order to justify standing Harry Potter is you denying the responsibility to hold the creator accountable. If we continue to deny this responsibility, the artist then continues to hold disproportionate power, receiving little to no consequences for their actions. In terms of films, in terms of music, in terms of books, in terms of YouTube videos, the audience holds all the power. If you continue to support the series, you are still supporting Rowling. And she is therefore getting away with her dangerous narrative around gender and the trans community. If you have already owned the books or the films, arguably you could yourself separate the art from the artist, as you rereading or rewatching the series is not directly funding Rowling in terms of money. For me personally, I find it very difficult to view Harry Potter in the same light, but it can be harder for others to let go of a series that held a very big place in their life. However, I'd like to just remind you, trans people are real. Hogwarts is not. If you take anything away from this video, I hope that it is at least a little bit of acknowledgement around the problems with J.K. Rowling as a writer and as a personality. It is horrible when an artist does something that taints their work, as it takes the enjoyment out of things that are actually really good or hold really important morals. But because we live in such a capitalist society where everything revolves around money and status, unfortunately, continuing to stan a series can be seen as quite problematic. And this is where I'm going to leave the video. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like and a comment about any of the issues that you think need mentioning or anything you agree or disagree with. It'd be very interesting to see what other people think about this. Make sure to click subscribe and turn on bell notifications if you're new. And with that, I'll see you soon.